Tere! Mina olen Kristi Jõeäär, Tehnopoli taskuhäälingu hääl. Täna toome teieni salvestused Tehnopol Startup Inkubaatori kohvihommikust, kus Lightyear'i kommunikatsioonijuht Karolina Laas-Dobreva räägib eduka startupi PR saladustest. Podcast on inglise keeles. Head kuulamist!
I've been working in fintech for over 5 years now. Started out at Wise. I joined Wise in 2018, so I was there for a really interesting time period. I went through, Wise pre-listing, post-listing. I went through going from TransferWise to Wise, lots of country expansions into completely new regions, lots of product expansions, which was a really wild ride to be on. And at Wise, I worked in the organic social team, and then I worked in the employer brand team. So I got quite a wide reach of working in different geos. There was in every day you were working on Asia and Europe and America, and then Brazil at the same time. And then exactly 2 years ago, I joined Lightyear at a very, very early stage. I joined when the product was only live in the UK. So I've been here now for when we launched all across Europe within one day, and our Series A announcement and all of the growth that's followed that. And I'll breeze through this. Lightyear is an investment platform, basically born out of two Estonian guys trying to figure out why people aren't investing and why people keep coming to them with questions around where do I even go to get started with investing? And they had no good answer to this. So looked into their market. In the US, 50% of people invest. It's pretty cool. Half of the population is growing their wealth. Looking into Europe, that number is a lot smaller. It's only at 15%, which is not really good for anyone. And the reason for that is really simple. Europe is very fragmented, which means investing is expensive, it's really tricky. And when you're in smaller countries in Europe, like Estonia, it's inaccessible. You don't have a platform that allows you to access global stock markets at a low price point or through a customer-friendly app. So Lightyear was born. The aim is to help make your money grow. The end goal is pushing that 15%. So Lightyear wants to make sure that Europe gets to that 50% where US is at, and even further in terms of people who invest. We're 55 people now, which is pretty crazy. I joined when I was, I think, 15. So it's been a wild ride. We have people that have built companies like Revolut, Robinhood, Wise, Bolt, Pipedrive. So a pretty cool gang of people. And we've done 3 funding series until now. So raised $35 million altogether. And maybe before we jump into PR, a little bit about why I'm here talking to you about PR today. The PR function and the comms function has been a really key aspect to Lightyear's growth. So from the very early days, before we had a name or before we had a product live, we were already working on different ways to build relationships with the media and relationships with journalists. So hopefully I can take you through a little bit of that journey today and give you some tips to take away. So when we look at what public relations is, when PR as a concept got started, all people had to form their opinions of you were very few channels. You had newspapers and television, essentially. And that's been the case for quite a long time until, obviously, tech came about and started changing all of this. So now you have so many channels that people are on constantly, so many channels that they hear about you from and form their opinions through, which meant that the concept of PR had to evolve as well. So in the old days, traditional PR meant you were given a list of journalists and a press release, and you were told, okay, go call all of them and make sure this piece of news gets in tomorrow's paper, which today, is drastically different. So today, when you look at a media house that used to only have a newspaper underneath them, today they run communities, they run events, they have probably a radio show somewhere, a podcast. You have things like awards and government relations. So the scope of PR has grown really, really big. And it's tricky to maybe define, but the way I put it down is that a PR channel can be any non-paid channel where your audience is at. And a lot of the times, especially in an early stage startup, you might be thinking, like, why even bother? Like, I have a million other things on my plate anyway, so why should I actually do PR or let that take away some of my time? I think the biggest thing here is the trust element. Ultimately, it's all about shaping the way people see you and what they know of you. And channels like press are a really good way to build trust with people, because people trust journalists to deliver unbiased content. And multiple touch points in outlets that people trust, that people have known for 5 years, 10 years, that's an amazing way to create brand awareness and relationships with people. It's free, which for a startup is obviously very, very important. PR gives you so many different channels, so many ways to actually target your message and not have it really cost a thing most times. And something that's really often overlooked is PR can be a really strong acquisition channel for you, which is kind of counterintuitive when you think of it. But PR gives you access to a really good audience through a trusted third party. So it's not you talking about your product, it's a journalist writing about your product, or it's a TV host talking about your product. And when you've got there, then that already gives people that layer of trust, like, oh, they were chosen to be on this TV show, or they were chosen to be in this article, so they must be really good. And that is super, super powerful. When we look into getting started with PR, the first question in everyone's mind is, when do I do it? When do I start spending my time on it? And the answer is very classical startup answer, which is as soon as possible. Startups always think about budgets, no matter what you do and no matter what you prioritize. And I appreciate that might mean that PR is kind of low on your priorities list, but I do think you should start thinking about this as soon as possible. Ultimately, your reputation is a long game. People form opinions of you no matter whether you feed into it or not. And PR is a great way to shape the way people think of you and the opinions that people have of you. And good relationships with the media, no matter the channel, can actually make or break your success, whether you have a big launch coming up, whether you're announcing a fundraising series. So to have that base is so, so important when you start building your company and expanding it. And then the best thing that a startup can have is actually a founder that's okay to get their hands dirty and okay to get basically being an early stage comms person and then being all the spokespeople at once for a few years to come at least. So a few tips on what to do as a founder or as an early stage comms person. The first one's really obvious. You have to know what you're building and who you're building for. And the key here is to have a very clear and concise way of talking about your product and your business. I think when you look at different startup websites today, a lot of the times you'll find that mission statements and product statements are essentially sentences formed of 8 different buzzwords that are really popular at the time. And then altogether, that tells you nothing. But when you have a really clear, concise, short message that tells people what you actually do right away, that's actually how you stand out today, which sounds very simple, but isn't easy to do. And then the second thing you can get doing is competitive research. So who's your competition? How do they position themselves? And what channels are they on? You can look into whether they get press coverage and then what outlets and what journalists cover them, whether their customers bring them up organically in online communities, because those are the channels that you want to be on too. Those are the channels that probably consist of people that really care about similar things to what you're building. And then tying into when to get started with PR, a great time is actually when you're not even launched yet, when your product isn't maybe even fully ready, or when you're just planning to start bringing it to the market. because building those media relationships is about a lot more than just selling your product to a journalist. So you can get started by taking all the relevant outlets, all the relevant journalists, community leaders, thought leaders, putting them into a big Excel sheet, and then just reaching out to them. You can very easily find people's or journalists' emails on Twitter or LinkedIn or news outlets. And generally, journalists love founders reaching out to them directly, especially at a very early stage. And then you want to meet as many of these people as possible for intros. And that would be a non-official intro, so that can be a meetup over morning coffee or a meetup over lunch, where you introduce yourself and your business to them in a very informal setting. And for this, I always go into journalist meetings or ask or send Lightyear's founders into journalist meeting with one thought. So what are the 3 key takeaways you want this journalist to have when they leave the conversation? And you can tailor these 3 key takeaways based on who you're meeting, how much they know about you and your company or your field. But that kind of helps you come up with the narrative you want to prepare when going into the meeting. And there's a few stories you have to make sure you get straight before going in. One is your company story and your founder's story. So why are you a founder? How did you stumble across the problem that your product's solving? How do you aim to scale that to fix the same problem for millions of people? And then the second angle is, with journal meets, you always have to be prepared to also comment on topical things happening in the market. Because a lot of the times, especially in the early stage, your product might not be ready enough. The journalist might not be ready to go out and write a full story about you and your company, but they might, on the background, be writing a topical piece about something that's happening in your field on the market. And then when you have strong opinions about something that's happening, a standout quote, then it can actually mean that you already get a mention and your company already gets a mention in a really good publication without you having to present your product. And these things don't usually happen the day after the meeting. These mentions can be pulled up by journalists a month after or 2 months after, which kind of tells you that PR really is a long-term game. And then, I think as a founder, instead of jumping straight into trying to figure out what your 10-page strategy document is for your company, it's more important to think about where can you have the most impact between now and when you launch, or between now and your next big milestone, and then try and figure out what are the quick wins you can action on there. And when you're at a stage where you think of hiring for PR, it really comes down to what your company is doing. So if you're a B2C company that's very heavily geared towards sales, maybe you sell houseware, for example. Would my first hire be PR? Probably not. My first marketing hire would probably be someone who can help me with e-commerce or the sales part of it. But that's very different when you work in a heavily regulated field like finance and like Lightyear, for example. Because when you work in finance, from day one or from day -1, you have to make sure you're already building trust and that reputable image not just between you and customers, but also between you and regulators and between you and partner banks or any other big institutions that you need in your corner. So first marketing hires can look very, very different. Depends on who you need, what you're building for, and who you're building for. And when you think about creating your story or your narrative, it's important to understand that at the beginning, your narrative doesn't have to be what it's going to be in 10 years' time. It just has to be relevant for you now. So in the early days, you really just need a baseline narrative. You don't need to go into full-blown brand exercises, which can sometimes seem like a really logical step to take as the first thing, but it might not be the most useful. So as you grow, it's actually okay to go in and change that narrative over time, because your narrative changes anyway. So your product changes, it grows. You're probably going to have to pivot your product at one point or the other. And it's okay to go in and slightly change what you're talking about, depending on when you're doing it and who you're doing it to. So when you look at Lightyear, for example, when we launched in the UK, our messaging to stand out in a really competitive market for an investment platform was, we don't charge hefty FX fees that every other broker would charge you to be able to invest in the US markets, for example. And then the narrative that came from that was, if TransferWise and Robinhood had a baby, that's what Lightyear would be. Then a little bit later, when we launched across Europe, the narrative was, Lightyear is here to give all of Europe low-cost, good access to the global markets. And today, we're live in 22 markets. We're building these sophisticated solutions for local investors wherever they're at. And now, we talk about being a global broker that's building local solutions, whoever you are and wherever you are. Another example is Uber, for example. So when they started out, they were all about taxes are expensive, screw taxes, get an Uber. Then they thought, can we do the same thing for the food delivery business? So their narrative changed. Then they introduced ride sharing to cut your costs even further. But all of those different narratives over time tied back to that core concept of Uber's here to make people's lives easier through transport. So you always have that core concept of what you start out with, but you can build on that as you go and as you launch different products to different people. At the beginning, it's going to be really hard for you to prove to an external stakeholder that you'll be successful in whatever you're doing in 10 years' time. So a journalist will ask you, why are you different? Or why is what you're building going to succeed? Because there's probably, in most cases, there's 5 or 10 other businesses that are building a very similar thing. And a journalist is never going to write a puff piece about what you plan to do in 10 years. They only want to write about what you're doing right now. So you kind of need to figure out, what are your strengths from the get-go? Do you have an experienced founding team? Have they maybe founded a previous Estonian unicorn? Do you have a unique founder story? Do you have well-known investors backing you? Is there a David versus Goliath angle to what you're building? Are you challenging the status quo? That's going to be really helpful for you in the beginning, because that's what people will remember, and that's what journalists want to portray of you. So if you look at Lightyear's early coverage, for example, you can see mentions of our investors. There's Richard Branson, there's David Hinrikus. You can see us being referenced as the TransferWise of trading, or Europe's answer to Robinhood. And what's really cool is that over time, as you grow and as your PR function grows, and as you start building those relationships, you can see these headlines turning from, Lightyear is an investment platform from early Wise employees, to just saying Lightyear. And instead of a headline saying Lightyear's founders, the headlines will start referring to our founders as Martin and Mikael by name. So that's like a really cool way to see how much stronger your brand is growing in the market at any time. And now, when you have your narrative down, how do you actually get into the news? The good thing is there's loads of ways. There's loads of different types of stories that you can come up with. You have product updates and company news. That's a very tangible thing that happens, and you can announce it. So new product launches, fundraisings, partnerships, anything. Then you have stories that you create, where the possibilities are actually endless. So for example, customer testimonials are a really good way to talk about your product in a non-salesy way. That's something that Wise, for example, did really, really well when they started out. Stories you create can be op-eds, they can be data pieces about research you've commissioned in your relevant area, or about data that you find from your customer behavior, for example. And then there's the cool concept of news tracking, which essentially means jumping on the bandwagon of an already topical theme. So for Lightyear, for example, we pass on interest on uninvested cash to users, which means when the European Central Bank ups their interest, which has happened loads over the past, year and a half, then every time the rate that we pass on to our customer goes up as well. And every time interest rates change, that's all over the business media, all over the news. And it's a really good way, a really organic way for us to jump into the media and say, the interest you earn on Lightyear has gone up. Meanwhile, the big bad banks are only giving you a tiny, tiny fraction of what they earn on you, and they keep the rest to themselves. So things like that. It can be a full-blown press release, it can be a full-blown story, or it can just be a comment that you send to the journalist that wrote a relevant article. And again, over time, you can see, instead of you trying to jump into the news when something relevant is happening, you can start seeing journalists come to you asking for comments about these news, which is like another really cool, tangible thing that somehow at some point starts to happen. And I think in the early stages, you don't have to be afraid of banging on the same drum. You need to be consistent with your messaging over the long term. It's harsh, but you're probably going to be the only person that sees every piece of coverage that you get. People are only going to see very few examples of what you put out there. So the messaging you create has to be, it has to serve the same purpose over a long period of time for people to actually understand who you are, what you do, how you can be useful for them. And the thing about startups is they're usually very product-led. So you're usually in the thick of it, building a product day in, day out, and you're really excited about it, and your founder's really excited about it. And it's really easy to think, oh, we're doing the best thing ever. Like, everyone must know about this. Every journalist surely wants to write about our product. No, they don't. It's really hard to get product news into the media. So that's where you have to get creative, which is the exciting thing about PR. What are the topics that surround you? What's the information you have to use, or the information you can get to talk about your story, your product, but not from the angle of, we're Lightyear, we're doing this. And this can be loads of different things. So as an investment platform, we have access to how people invest. And that can create really cool data stories, especially if you put them together with something topical that's happening in the world. You can use customer case studies, or anything really that kind of feeds into what you're doing. And then on the flip side, you can also use your team's expertise. So for example, our founders, built Wise from the early days. We have our COO is ex-president of Robinhood UK. So we can utilize their knowledge and their expertise in topics like how to build a startup, how to scale a startup, how to do fundraising. So there are loads of the places where you can actually get into the news through data, customers, thought leadership, places like that. Yeah, it's important to generally keep in mind that it's not a journalist's job to write about your product or sell your product for you. They have to forward interesting news to a wide range of people. And then whatever the message, your job in comms or as an early stage founder is to make sure your product, what you're doing, is packaged up in the most exciting way, in the most fresh way to hit those news. And another thing to think about is how to choose your outlets. So different outlets serve different stories. When you're an early stage startup, you probably want to do one of two things. You want to either get new customers or you want to get investors. And one piece of coverage doesn't really serve both of these things. So your investors probably come from the likes of Sifted or TechCrunch or The Times, which is not usually where your customers would sit. They would be reading those smaller, more niche outlets that talk about the topics that they're interested in, the products that they use. Or they would be reading those national mass outlets where, if you get a mention in CNBC, for example, or BBC in the UK, that's going to be a huge trust point. It doesn't even have to be about your product, like as I talked about before. It can also be you commenting on something that's currently topical, and that's already a huge, huge trust element for you. And choosing the right outlet also means you have a better chance of landing your story, because first of all, you're going to have the right journalist who's probably going to be interested in what you want to talk about, and that journalist is going to have access to the right people. So there's a whole flow of like what can go right or wrong depending on whether you have the right outlets. for your story. And then we come into the fun world of measuring PR, which is an interesting concept because most of what you do within these PR channels is very elusive. But that doesn't really fly in today's world or in startups. You have to be able to somehow show the impact of what you're doing. And there are things you can do. So especially in an early stage, when you're not running any paid ads, for example, you can attribute your growth to organic channels. So that's like one hurdle eliminated. What I like to do is try and connect timelines. So I'll take, for example, a business metric that's important to me over time, for example, user signups over a month, and I'll look at where spikes in user signups came from. Do they correlate with when we got this really good piece in this really good outlet? Do they correlate with when our founder ran this webinar? And there you can kind of make those connections of, oh, this article was really good for us. Appearing at this community event was really good for us versus, oh, maybe this wasn't that good. And you can take that up a notch as well. So you can take your main metrics, whether that's sales, user signups, and compare those to the number of articles you get, for example, when you start getting more coverage. So what we do at Lightyear every month, we do a monthly PR report where one part of it is we'll divide a month into weeks, and then we'll look at how many user signups we got that week, and we put that into correlation with how many mentions in the media we got that week. And that will help you kind of create and validate those hypotheses of, does more media help my business get more users? Does, when I appear at community events, does that help me make more sales? Things like that. And over the long term, you can kind of see, it's not going to be an exact science, but you can definitely see those trends, those trends happening. And then another really cool way is like, how did you hear about us questionnaire, which can pop up when someone lands on your landing page. It can be an onboarding survey that people get when they finish onboarding to your platform. And that doesn't just have to be about press. That can be about all different channels you're using when you run a campaign, for example, out of home, which again, notoriously difficult to measure. You can add that into your how did you hear about us questionnaire for a month or 2 months time. And then when people visit your website, they tell you where they heard about you. So yeah, another really cool way. And there's actually loads you can do to measure these elusive PR efforts. You just kind of have to not be afraid to get down and dirty again. And yeah, maybe to wrap this up, a few key takeaways from my side. Maybe the most important one is just get creative. Competition to get into the media, no matter the channel, is so high right now. Everyone wants to be in the media, and then every journalist is looking for a story that's not this startup launched this product. So you have to be creative on all ends of this game. Don't sweat over long-term strategies. This can be a really hard concept to wrap your head around, and there is a time and a place for longer-term strategies, but especially when you're starting out. Think about, the quick wins, the dirty wins that you can get that will get you the most impact to get you to your launch or the next milestone in your journey. And then you can really do a lot yourself. Whether you're a founder or an early operator or an early marketing hire, there's so much value in you just doing a little bit of the dirty work, reaching out to these journalists, taking them out for coffee, and starting to build your relationships. And then when in the future you start having news for them, they're way more likely to open your email or get back to you, or even really care about what you do. And then, oh, wrong button, sorry. That's it from me. Thank you, guys. I think we almost made it exactly on time as well.
Suur tänu kuulamast. Selleks, et olla kursis, mis toimub Tehnopoli kogukonnas, jälgi uudiseid ja ürituste infot tehnopol.ee.